Victor wielded superhuman strength born from a compound in his veins. The fatal cost, it was slowly burning him alive. Sky was a brilliant healer blending ancient wisdom and science to mend the incurable. A newly arrived therapist haunted by a past love. Then Victor walked into her life. And fate began to rewrite them both. Not a single star hung over Savannah that night. The entire port was swallowed by thick salt fog, laced with the smell of machine oil, rusted steel, and gunpowder. Under the washed-out glare of the floodlights, shipping containers stacked into a massive steel labyrinth. And at the heart of that maze, the Sterling family's men were pinned down under relentless fire from the D'Amico Alliance out of New York. From the top of a container stack, Victor Sterling surveyed the battlefield below. "Sir, they've locked down all 3 routes into Zone C." Reed shouted over the radio, his voice barely cutting through the deafening crack of gunfire. "If the convoy doesn't break out in the next 2 minutes, we lose the whole shipment." Victor didn't answer right away. His eyes swept across every firing position, every gap, every movement the enemy made. D'Amico hadn't come just to steal tonight's shipment of raw diamonds. They'd come to test whether the Sterling Empire still held the South in an iron grip. Below, Reed fired cover shots while dragging a wounded guard into shelter. 2 more Sterling men went down in seconds. Armor-piercing rounds hammered into the thick steel plating, throwing sparks inches from their faces. A bullet screamed past the edge of the container where Victor stood. His hand curled into a fist. "Reed." His voice was low, cold, and clean as a blade. "Clear a path for the convoy." "And the rest?" Victor stepped to the edge of the steel platform and looked straight down at the sea of men and weapons below. "Leave them to me." In that instant, his heartbeat spiked. Not from fear. Something sleeping in his bloodstream had just been woken up. A violent surge of heat exploded from his chest, racing through his shoulders, spine, and limbs. Every muscle fiber clenched like cables pulled to their breaking point. For one brief second, the air around him seemed to warp. Then Victor dropped. His body became a dark blur tearing through the fog. The sniper above barely had time to swing his rifle before Victor was already on him. The first punch drove into the steel barrier, crushing it inward. Metal shrieked, and an entire section of the warehouse wall collapsed, burying 2 D'Amico soldiers beneath it. "Move!" Reed roared. Sterling's men surged through the opening and launched a counterattack. Victor didn't stop. He leapt to the next container, took out another firing position above, then dropped hard into the transport lane between 2 rows of cargo. One of D'Amico's men panicked and emptied his magazine. The bullets tore up the concrete behind Victor's back, but he was already standing right in front of the man. The second punch came down like a steel hammer. The man flew into a metal door and crumpled to the ground without drawing another breath. Across the port, gunfire, clashing steel, and screams fused into a single suffocating wall of chaos. Victor kept moving through the fog, cold, precise, like a predator built for one purpose, to end wars fast. 3 minutes later, the tide had turned completely. D'Amico's formation shattered. The survivors scrambled for the secondary dock, leaving behind bodies and dark smears of blood across the freezing concrete. Sterling's diamond convoy remained untouched. The battle ended as fast as it had erupted. Savannah sank back into the eerie silence of a port at night. Victor stood in the middle of the battlefield, gun smoke still clinging to his shoulders. To anyone watching, he was just a young king who'd crushed his enemies once again. Only he knew that victory hadn't come free. The heat hit him almost immediately. Victor stopped cold. One beat. Then another. His blood felt like it was actually boiling. Not the exaggerated rush of post-battle adrenaline, this was real, searing pain, deep in the bone, racing through every vein. The muscle fibers he'd just pushed past their limit sent back their delayed screams. His nervous system felt like it had been stretched taut on iron hooks. "Sir!" Reed rushed in to catch him. "Get in the vehicle. Now." Victor didn't push him away. He was far too familiar with this stage. The armored SUV was waiting in the shadows, engine already running. The back door swung open. Inside, a cold immersion tank, prepared with dry ice and heavily salted water. Reed helped Victor into the car with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this more times than either of them cared to count. Victor lowered himself into the freezing water. A sharp hiss rose the instant his overheated skin touched the surface. The cold pierced through dense muscle, but it wasn't enough to put out the fire smoldering inside. Reed slid a needle into his vein and pushed high-dose painkillers and antibiotics, his face unreadable. No complaints. No wasted grimace. Between the two of them, that silence had become a terrifying habit. Victor closed his eyes. 20 years ago, when he was 16, a catastrophic car accident had nearly killed him. The lower half of his body was crushed beyond repair. Every doctor said the same thing, death or permanent disability. In desperation, his parents, Kane and Leah, authorized a surgeon named Thomas Thorne to try an experimental treatment, a compound called Titan G. Titan G saved his life. But it also rewrote his body at the cellular level, fusing with his muscle fibers in ways no one had anticipated. The changes were subtle at first. Faster reflexes. Greater endurance. Nothing that couldn't be explained by youth. Thorne monitored Victor for 2 years, satisfied that the compound had stabilized, prescribed a long-term maintenance protocol, and left Atlanta. But that protocol was designed for a body living in peace. Not for a body forged in war. When Victor was 26, his mother Leah was killed in a brutal ambush meant for Kane. The grief hit like a chemical detonation. Victor stopped sleeping. He trained through the nights until his knuckles bled. He pushed his body past every boundary Thorne's protocol had ever set, and triggered something the maintenance regimen was never built to contain. Titan G, dormant for a decade, responded to the extreme physical and emotional stress as if loss itself were the catalyst it had been waiting for. Every latent mutation surged to life at once. His muscles expanded. His speed doubled. His strength became something that belonged in myth, not medicine. From that day on, Victor Sterling all but forgot how to lose a war. And from that day on, his body began to fail, piece by piece. Every time he activated the power, he became faster, stronger, more ruthless. But the cost was heat building in his bloodstream, muscle fibers tearing apart, and a nervous system being worn down in ways no doctor could fully explain. The world saw only the legend of an undefeated man. Only Victor and Reed knew the truth. If this kept going, the day would come when his body simply couldn't take it anymore. And on that day, Victor Sterling wouldn't die at the hands of an enemy. He'd die from the very thing that made his name. The SUV tore away from Savannah, cutting through the brightly lit streets of Atlanta. Victor opened his eyes and looked at his warped reflection in the bulletproof glass. Out there, the world called him the young king of the South. Only he knew the Sterling Empire was propped up by a body on the verge of burning out. Reed's dry ice cooling system and high-dose antibiotics were nothing more than stopgap measures now. After Savannah, Victor could feel the damage inside with terrifying clarity. Reed glanced at him through the rearview mirror, quiet for a long moment before speaking. Every specialist in New York shook their head when they saw your muscle scans. His voice was steady, but his hands gripped the steering wheel a fraction tighter than usual. However, I just got word that a new doctor has returned to Atlanta. Dr. Sky Vance. 34. Exceptional resume from top rehabilitation centers across Europe. She just opened a premium rehab clinic downtown. Her methods combine biowave technology with acupuncture and Eastern herbal medicine, something we've never tried. Victor said nothing. His fingers brushed absently over the old scar on the back of his hand, the same hand that had been rebuilt under Thomas Thorne's knife 20 years ago. He wondered, briefly, where Thorne was now. Then pushed the thought aside. A brand new clinic, he asked. You think it's worth a shot? She's treated NBA stars and billionaires who demand nothing short of perfection, sir. What caught my attention wasn't just the European credentials, it's the way she sees the human body as an energy system, not just muscle and bone. With a profile like that, I believe she may be the only person capable of decoding what's happening inside you. Victor looked out through the window. Atlanta was receding behind them, giving way to old oak trees lining the road toward downtown. He didn't answer Reed. But he didn't say no. And for a man who'd been refusing hope for 10 years, that silence was already an answer. Sky's clinic wasn't in some cold glass high-rise. It sat inside a sleek, minimalist villa tucked behind old oak trees. Victor pushed open the heavy oak door, and the delicate chime of bronze wind bells rang out, a sound completely at odds with the growl of the V8 engine he'd just left outside. Inside was a strange convergence of a Swiss lab and an Eastern tea house. The scent of lemongrass, ginger, and sandalwood wrapped around him, easing the raw edges of his overtaxed senses. Sky stood behind a reception desk carved from a single slab of wood, her slender fingers moving across the screen of an ultra-thin 3D bio-wave scanner. She didn't look up right away, she was finishing a note in a patient file. "Good afternoon, Mr. Sterling. Glad you could make it on time." Luminous honey-brown skin. Naturally curly hair pinned neatly up. A tailored white coat that only sharpened the impression of a woman in complete command of her domain. "Reed says you're the best in the city," Victor replied. Only then did Sky look up. Those amber eyes swept over his frame, not the kind of admiring look he was used to getting from women. This was the gaze of a scientist who'd just spotted an anomaly. Her elegant brows lifted slightly, and she stepped out from behind the desk. "Please, sit." She gestured toward a dark leather chair. "I've reviewed your file, but honestly, beneath that large frame of yours, you're hiding a level of physical deterioration I've never seen in 10 years of practice." She moved closer, close enough for Victor to feel the almost physical intensity of her observation. "Can you feel it? The core of your body is screaming. The heat in your bloodstream is at critical levels. This isn't ordinary muscular trauma. Your body is burning itself alive from the inside out." Victor held her gaze in silence. No one, not even the top specialists in New York, had ever described what he felt every day with that kind of precision. "Your instincts are impressive," he said. "In this clinic, my instincts are the law. The scanner data is the evidence." Sky replied without a flicker of hesitation. "The doctors in New York tried to put out your fire with chemicals. That's why they failed. I'm not going to put it out. I'm going to teach you how to regulate it. But first, we need an emergency heat release protocol, liquid nitrogen combined with herbal acupuncture to save the muscle fibers that are being cooked alive." Victor studied her. Liquid nitrogen he understood. But silver needles and herbal medicine? This was his body, the only real weapon he had, and he'd never handed it over to anyone like this. "Acupuncture and nitrogen," he repeated, his voice dropping low. "You're sure about that?" Sky turned toward the treatment room, where a matte black nitrogen chamber sat exhaling pale clouds of cold vapor. Then she paused and glanced back at him. The stern amber of her eyes softened with the faintest glint of amusement. "Step into the treatment room, Mr. Sterling. In there, I'll need you to temporarily check your expensive suit, your boss persona, and your skepticism about traditional medicine into the locker. For the next few hours, just think of yourself as a patient due for scheduled maintenance. I promise I won't scratch your $1 million machine, or turn it into some bizarre East meets West science experiment." The shift caught him completely off guard, cool and clinical to warm and playful in one breath. The pressure in his chest eased. He found himself smiling without meaning to, and following her into the treatment room without another question. Between the sleek medical equipment and the nitrogen chamber breathing cold vapor stood a soft leather treatment bed, where the scent of sandalwood oil was strongest. "Lie down. 3 minutes of core cooling in the nitrogen chamber to stabilize the muscle fibers. After that, I'll handle the most important part myself." When the freezing vapor had done its work and receded, Victor lay face down on the bed, the deep chill still clinging to his skin. Sky stepped close, signaling her assistant to prepare the instrument tray and switch on the infrared lamp. She didn't rush. Slender fingertips glided along his spine, pressing gently into the points he knew were inflamed beneath the surface. "Relax, hero. You're wound up like a slab of steel fresh from the forge." She warmed the hair-thin silver needles over an herbal flame, then placed the first one into the pressure point at the base of his neck. No sharp pain, just a faint current running down his spine, followed by the sensation of trapped heat finally finding a way out. "I'm opening your release valves." She rotated the needle gently, moving around him, each insertion precise and rhythmic. Every point she touched, the tearing pain of the past 48 hours softened, replaced by a relief so deep Victor almost didn't believe it was real. He couldn't remember the last time he'd let someone this close without instinctively calculating how to neutralize them. But these hands carried no threat. Only certainty. Only care. His muscles unclenched one by one, as if they'd been waiting for something he didn't know how to ask for. Done. Now lie still and let the herbs settle in. Don't rush back to being a boss, at least not in this room. She adjusted the covering over him, then stepped out. 40 minutes later, a nurse removed the needles and told him to rest another hour. The door had barely closed when Sky returned, no longer in her white coat, now wearing a sand-colored silk blouse, carrying a steaming cup of tea. Drink this. It'll help stabilize your blood pressure after the heat release. Her fingers brushed the warm ceramic as she handed him the cup. The rich herbal scent and the stillness of the room made his eyelids heavy. Victor slipped into a deep, dreamless sleep without realizing it, a rare thing for a man who usually slept with a gun under his pillow. When he woke, the exhaustion was gone. Victor stood, straightened his suit jacket. The heaviness in his muscles had vanished, replaced by a lightness he'd almost forgotten existed. He walked to the front office, where Sky was organizing files under a pool of warm golden light. She looked up when she saw him in the doorway. Awake already? That sleep was your nervous system's self-defense response once the pressure was released. How do you feel? Still burning in the joints? For the first time in 10 years, Victor said, standing across from her at the oak desk, I don't feel like I'm carrying a block of molten iron inside me. Thank you, Dr. Sky. That's my job. But don't get overconfident, your body just went through an emergency overhaul. Nothing more. How long before I can get back in the field? Sky paused, her hand resting on the stack of patient files. She looked him straight in the eye. 48 hours. You'll recover about 90% of your function. She stepped closer, close enough for him to catch the faint scent of tea mingled with the herbal fragrance on her skin. But I have to be straight with you, Victor. Your muscle fibers are aging far faster than they should for a man your age. Like a violin string held under too much tension for too long, it's slowly losing its natural elasticity. That's going to become a serious problem if you want to keep relying on this level of physical power long-term. She crossed her arms. You need a long-term, consistent treatment plan. Proper maintenance after every major exertion. Don't wait until this machine falls apart completely before coming back to me. Because by then, not even the most mystical Eastern medicine in the world could put it back together. Victor held her gaze. Behind the professionalism, he noticed something else, the way she described the fiber expansion pattern, the way she used accelerated aging instead of damage, too precise, too specific, as if she'd studied this phenomenon long before she ever met him. I understand, he said. I'll see you at the next session. Reed was waiting outside, unable to hide his shock at the way Victor came down the steps, light, fluid, nothing like the man who'd nearly collapsed on the Savannah docks 2 days before. Victor paused at the door and turned back. Sky was leaning against the oak doorframe, the fading Atlanta sunset casting a warm glow over her. I'll be back next week. She didn't smile too brightly. Just a slight nod, then she handed him a minimalist business card that still carried a trace of lemongrass and ginger. Victor. She called him by name, no title, no formality. You can command a transportation empire stretching thousands of miles. But if you never learn to master the fire in your own bloodstream, you'll end up as nothing but a pile of glittering ash. Victor got into the car. Reed started the engine. The Bentley pulled away from the oak-lined street. In the rearview mirror, the clinic's warm glow shrank and disappeared behind the trees. His hand was still holding the business card. He'd walked in expecting nothing more than another failed medical appointment. He was leaving with the unsettling feeling that Sky Vance had seen more of him in 2 hours than most people had seen in 10 years. And that she was already solving a puzzle she hadn't told him about yet. Her electric SUV glided smoothly down Peachtree Avenue, turning onto the oak-shaded streets leading toward Atlanta's northern outskirts. The deep violet of a southern twilight was settling in, but in her mind, the image of her last patient of the day remained as sharp as a high-resolution X-ray. Victor Sterling. Sky had treated hundreds of elite athletes, heavyweight boxers, NBA superstars with bodies pushed to the extreme. But Victor was something else entirely. When her hand touched the heat radiating off his skin, she felt more than temperature. She felt a violent strain deep within the core of his cells. His muscle fibers were expanding abnormally, bearing the marks of a force trying to break free from an ordinary human frame. Like a jet engine installed inside the shell of a race car, breathtakingly powerful and terrifyingly fragile. A rare condition, or a brutal form of evolution. Hands tightening on the wheel, she let her clinical mind run free. The heat signature, the pattern of cellular expansion, the way his fibers operated under a constant chemical stimulus, all of it pointed to something she'd studied extensively during her years in Shanghai. A military-grade compound called Titan G, briefly trialed in the early 2000s before being pulled due to uncontrollable long-term side effects. She'd written an entire thesis chapter on Titan G's theoretical metabolic pathways, specifically the rare scenario where the compound fused permanently with muscle tissue instead of being metabolized out. Her supervising professor in Shanghai had called that chapter, brilliantly paranoid. And Julian, the man she'd once thought she'd spend her life with, had laughed and said she was building treatment plans for patients who didn't exist. Sky frowned at the windshield. Victor Sterling's body felt exactly like a patient who wasn't supposed to exist. She wasn't ready to jump to conclusions. She needed more data. But the outlines of a tailored formula were already taking shape in her mind. He didn't just need recovery. He needed preservation. Reconstruction. A way to rebuild without destroying what was left. The car turned onto the gravel drive leading to her grandparents' colonial-style house. Warm light spilled from the arched windows. The scent of South African chicken and bean stew drifted from the kitchen. Grandpa Zola sat on the porch, Grandma Amara bustled around the dining table, a scene so familiar that sometimes Sky forgot her life had ever been any different. Her parents were still in Shanghai. Her father, a renowned traditional Chinese medicine practitioner throughout the Jiangnan region, and her mother, a sharp, formidable South African surgeon, had chosen to dedicate themselves to their work there. They loved her, but in the way people who are too busy loving science tend to love, regular phone calls, timely transfers, and the firm belief that their daughter was strong enough to handle everything on her own. And most of the time, they were right. Sky had never lacked for anything. Her family gave her knowledge. 5 years of advanced training in Shanghai gave her elite skills. European credentials gave her prestige. Family financial support gave her the confidence to open her own clinic without answering to a single investor. Her grandparents gave her the warmest emotional anchor anyone far from home could hope for. She had everything. And precisely because she had everything, the one blow powerful enough to bring her down came from the place she'd left most unguarded. Dinner ended. Sky helped wash the dishes, listened to her grandfather's neighborhood stories, laughed at the right moments, nodded at the right pauses. Then she excused herself to her room. She sat down at her desk, opened her laptop, stared at her patient list. The cursor didn't move. She was thinking about Julian. Julian Thorne. Son of the surgeon Thomas Thorne, once a celebrated name in Atlanta's medical circles before relocating to the East Coast. Julian had inherited his father's surgically precise hands and a razor-sharp intellect. He'd met Sky in Shanghai at a regenerative medicine symposium, and she'd been drawn in immediately, not just by his brilliance, but because Julian was the only person she'd ever met who could debate Eastern pharmacology with her until 3 in the morning and never look bored. 5 years. 5 years that were more than just romance. They'd lived together. Researched together. Pulled overnight shifts at the hospital together. Waded through the mud of Yunnan's mountains hunting for rare medicinal herbs. Julian had held her on the floor of a laboratory when they were both too exhausted to make it home. He'd read her thesis drafts before anyone else, scrawled notes in the margins in his slanting handwriting, told her, "You're the best doctor I've ever known, Sky," and she'd believed it, not because she needed validation, but because she trusted the man saying it. That was the part that hurt most. Sky didn't doubt her medical skills. She knew she was good. She knew her hands could read things scanners missed, knew her clinical instincts were sharper than most of her peers. Julian couldn't take that from her, no one could. But he'd taken something else. He'd taken her belief that she could truly see through another person. Not a person on a hospital bed. But the person sitting across from her every evening, eating with her, sleeping beside her, telling her he loved her. She'd discovered that Julian had been secretly collaborating with pharmaceutical companies, promoting expensive replacement surgeries over the restorative methods she believed in. Not for science. For money. For prestige. For the connections that would accelerate his career. And he'd hidden it from her, the woman who shared his bed, his desk, and his ideals for 5 years, without blinking. When she confronted him, Julian didn't deny it. He sat across from her in their apartment in Shanghai's Pudong district, swirling a glass of wine, and said in a voice so calm she wanted to throw her entire acupuncture kit at his face. "You're talented, Sky. But you're naive. The world doesn't pay for healing. The world pays for fixing. And if you can't see that difference, you'll always be a good doctor in a small clinic that nobody's ever heard of." He didn't say sorry. He said you're naive. As if those 5 years, the sleepless nights, the treks to the ends of the earth, every time she'd put her own career aside to prioritize the us she thought was unbreakable, were simply proof of how foolish she'd been. Sky packed her bags that night. She didn't cry. Didn't scream. She folded each shirt, stacked each box of books, and walked out of the apartment with her back straight, her eyes dry, and a hole in her chest that no medical textbook had a cure for. She flew back to Atlanta 2 days later. And now, more than a year on, she'd opened her clinic, built a patient roster, started rebuilding from scratch. But on nights like this, when the house was too quiet and she sat alone in front of a laptop screen, what rose up wasn't longing for Julian. It was the question, I lived next to someone for 5 years without seeing who he really was. So who can I trust now? A woman who had everything, intellect, family, finances, career, and still failed at the simplest thing of all, reading people. It wasn't the pain of someone who'd been deprived. It was the pain of someone who believed she could never be fooled. Sky closed the laptop. She stood and walked to the window. Atlanta's skyline glittered in the distance. Her grandparents were probably asleep by now. The house was silent, just the sound of crickets outside and her own breathing. And somehow, Victor Sterling's face surfaced in her mind again. Not the terrifying crime boss the world saw. But the moment he'd lain on her treatment bed, eyes closed, every guard dropped, the first time he'd let a stranger touch the pain he'd been hiding for years. He'd trusted her. A man who trusted no one had trusted her. And she, a woman who'd sworn never to trust too quickly again, found something in her chest soften at the memory of those eyes. Sky shook her head. She wouldn't let herself think any further. She went back to the desk, opened her laptop again, but not the patient list. She opened an old folder from her Shanghai days, the Titan G research files that Julian had once laughed at. The theoretical models she'd built for a patient who didn't exist. That patient was now lying on her treatment bed. And at least in this domain, the domain of medicine, of knowledge, of her own 2 hands, Sky Vance knew for certain she wasn't wrong. She opened the first file. If she was right, if Victor really was carrying Titan G in his body, then Julian hadn't just been wrong about her. He'd been wrong about the patient who didn't exist. And Sky Vance was not the kind of woman who left a puzzle half-solved when the answer was starting to show. The 4th treatment session started like the 3 before it, nitrogen, needles, herbs, silence. But this time, while Sky was gently rotating a needle at the Fengqi point behind his neck, Victor asked a question that had nothing to do with medicine. Lemongrass and ginger. You blend this essential oil yourself? Sky's hand paused for half a second. That's right. My father's recipe. He says lemongrass clears the qi, ginger keeps you warm. Together, they help patients relax. Your father's in Shanghai. Still there. My grandparents are here in Atlanta. She didn't elaborate. Victor didn't push. But he noticed that this was the first time he'd asked about her family, and she'd answered. The following session, Sky asked something back. The scar on the back of your right hand. Reconstructive surgery. Car accident when I was 16. Who operated? A doctor named Thorne. He left Atlanta after that. Sky nodded without comment. But Victor noticed that her fingers moved slower across the scar, as though she were reading something in it that he couldn't see. The treatment sessions ended, but the conversations didn't. Victor's first texts were always about the herbs. Tonight's ginger dose was more bitter than usual. Is that normal? And Sky would reply in doctor mode, normal. Aged ginger is more bitter than young ginger. If it's hard to drink, add a little honey. But gradually, the messages grew longer. Victor told her about the smell of ginger in his mother's kitchen, not because she'd asked, but because her answer about aged ginger had unlocked a memory he couldn't hold back. Sky read it, went quiet for a while, then told him that her grandmother used ginger for everything too, from cooking to curing colds, and she'd grown up believing ginger could fix anything until medical school taught her otherwise. Victor read that message at 2 in the morning in his darkened study and realized he was smiling. He couldn't remember the last time he'd smiled at 2 a.m. Then, on the 17th night, he counted, not on purpose, but he counted. Sky sent a message with just 4 words. Are you still up? Not a medical question. Victor stared at the screen longer than necessary, then typed back. Yes. You. Same. Sitting on the balcony. Atlanta at night is so different from Shanghai. Much quieter. Sometimes too quiet, makes you think too much. Victor didn't ask what she was thinking about. He just typed. Savannah at night is even quieter. But a different kind of quiet. The kind that comes after everything is over. Sky didn't reply immediately. 3 minutes later. That kind of quiet, are you used to it? I've lived with it for 10 years. This time, Sky went silent for a long while. Victor thought she'd fallen asleep. Then his phone buzzed. Then we're more alike than I thought. Go to sleep, Victor. You still have to show up on time tomorrow. Victor set the phone down. He knew the line between patient and doctor was thinning by the day. And he knew she felt it too. What he didn't know was that one of them was about to rebuild that wall, faster and more suddenly than he'd expected. The change came without warning. At the 6th session, Sky handed Victor's case to Dr. Nguyen, the clinic's deputy director, a specialist in musculoskeletal rehabilitation, and the person she trusted most after herself. The critical phase is done, she told Victor over the phone, her voice so professional and composed that even she could hear how hollow it sounded. The maintenance stage doesn't require my direct involvement anymore. Dr. Nguyen will monitor you going forward. The clinic is expanding, and I need to focus on management and new cases. All of it was true. The clinic was busy. Dr. Nguyen was more than capable. The maintenance phase genuinely didn't need the lead physician. But the real reason was somewhere else entirely. Sky knew. She knew better than anyone. Last night, after texting Victor until nearly 3 in the morning, she'd lain in bed and realized something that made her chest tighten. She was waiting for his messages. Not the way a doctor waits for patient feedback. The way a woman lies in the dark, watches the screen light up, and feels her chest grow a little warmer. That feeling was terrifyingly familiar. Julian had made her feel the same way. Those late nights in Shanghai, the endless messages, the sense that she'd finally found someone who understood her. And 5 years later, she discovered she was nothing more than a line item in his career blueprint. I lived next to someone for 5 years without seeing him clearly. And now, after a few weeks of late-night texting, I think I can trust what, exactly? And Victor wasn't some medical professor or fellow surgeon. He was a mafia boss. His world was one where concealment, deception, and manipulation were basic survival skills. If Julian, a doctor, had blinded her for 5 years, how long could Victor Sterling blind her? Sky couldn't bring herself to answer that question. So she did the only thing she knew how to do when she felt control slipping away. She stepped back. Created distance. Put Victor back where he belonged in the clinic system, as a patient. If he was only a patient, she wouldn't have to worry about reading him wrong. Because she'd never read a patient wrong. Victor didn't ask why. He showed up at the clinic on schedule, saw Dr. Nguyen, followed the treatment plan. Nguyen was good, skilled hands, clean technique, nothing missing. But each time Victor lay on the treatment bed, he felt the absence of something he couldn't name. Like hearing a piece of music played note perfect but by the wrong conductor. He didn't call Sky. Didn't text. Didn't request a different doctor. But he watched. Every visit, he arrived 15 minutes early, enough time to sit in the waiting area, drink a cup of tea, and look through the frosted glass separating the treatment rooms from the hallway. Sky was always there, moving between rooms, talking with staff, checking equipment. White coat, hair pinned up, decisive steps, but Victor noticed something that probably no one else caught: she never walked past his treatment room anymore. She was avoiding him. Not the obvious kind, not turning her back and walking away. The subtle kind, the kind where a smart person quietly rearranges their entire route through their own clinic to avoid accidentally running into someone. Victor had lived long enough in a world where every behavior carried meaning to recognize this: people don't go to the trouble of avoiding something they don't care about. He asked Nguyen, in the most casual tone he could manage, "Dr. Sky seems busier than before lately?" Nguyen nodded, suspecting nothing. "She's expanding the clinic, adding a neurorab department. Working late every night. Honestly, sometimes I think she's more tired than usual. But she's not the type to let anyone see that." Victor didn't ask anything more. But the phrase, "not the type to let anyone see," lodged in his mind and refused to leave. It stirred something painfully familiar, because that was exactly how people described him. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, right after Victor finished his session with Nguyen. He was standing at the reception desk settling payment when the oak door swung open. A woman in her early 60s walked in, gray tweed dress, Hermes bag, platinum hair cropped short, and the bearing of someone accustomed to being served exactly to her specifications from the moment she woke up until the moment she went to sleep. "I want to speak with the manager," she said, not loudly, but with an edge sharp enough to cut. The receptionist, a young woman named Hannah, looked up, her face going pale. "Mrs. Whitmore, Dr. Sky will." "I didn't ask what Dr. Sky will. I asked who manages this clinic." Mrs. Whitmore placed an invoice on the counter. "Last week's session, your staff charged me double because of a system error. I had to call 3 times before anyone even acknowledged it. 3 times. I am not the kind of client you can treat this way." Hannah opened her mouth to explain, but Mrs. Whitmore wasn't finished. "And this time, I don't want to hear 'sorry' from a receptionist. I want the person in charge to speak with me. Directly." Victor stood a few steps away, watching in silence. He noticed Hannah was trembling, not from fear, but from embarrassment. The fault belonged to the clinic, and she knew it. 2 minutes later, Sky appeared. She walked out from the back hallway, white coat, straight posture, face composed. She greeted Mrs. Whitmore with a nod and said, "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm Sky Vance, owner of this clinic. I'm sorry for the inconvenience. Give me a few minutes to review the system, and I'll get back to you right away." Mrs. Whitmore sat down in the waiting area, her expression still ice cold. Sky spoke quietly to Hannah, "Pull up last week's payment records." 5 minutes later, Sky returned with an iPad. She sat down across from Mrs. Whitmore, her tone calm and direct. "Mrs. Whitmore, we've confirmed the error is on our side. The billing system double-logged a treatment session. The difference will be refunded today. I also apologize on behalf of Hannah and the entire staff for the delay in resolving this." Mrs. Whitmore looked at her, thin lips pressed together. "A refund is a given. But I want 3 complimentary sessions on top of that. For the inconvenience. And for the unprofessional attitude." Sky didn't nod. "Mrs. Whitmore, this was a technical error, not an attitude problem. Hannah received your feedback and escalated it through the proper channels. The clinic takes full responsibility for the billing mistake, and we're happy to offer you 1 complimentary session as a sincere apology. But 3 sessions is beyond what's reasonable for this type of incident." Mrs. Whitmore straightened in her chair, eyes narrowing. "Are you refusing a client?" "I'm treating you and my staff with equal fairness," Sky replied, her voice neither rising nor falling. "Hannah made a process error, and she'll receive additional training. But she wasn't unprofessional. I can't agree to compensation based on an inaccurate assessment." Silence. Mrs. Whitmore placed her Hermes bag on her lap, her gaze cooling by another degree. "I'll be reconsidering whether to continue using this clinic. And I'll be reconsidering whether to share this experience with my friends." She delivered it lightly, but the weight was unmistakable, the kind of veiled threat Atlanta's upper class excelled at. Skye was about to respond when a low voice cut in from behind the reception desk. Mrs. Whitmore. Victor stepped forward, unhurried, hands in his pockets. He didn't stand beside Skye. He stood slightly in front of her, a position that anyone fluent in body language would read immediately. He was shielding her. I'm Victor Sterling. I'm also a patient here. The name Sterling made Mrs. Whitmore flinch, however much she tried to hide it. Anyone who'd lived in Atlanta long enough knew that name. I happened to overhear the conversation, Victor continued, his voice as casual as someone discussing the weather. Dr. Skye just acknowledged the error, offered a full refund, and added a complimentary session. For a newly opened clinic, that's a remarkably fair response. He paused, looking her directly in the eye. As for sharing this experience with your friends, I'm sure you'll share the facts as they are. Because a woman of your standing certainly doesn't need to exaggerate a minor technical glitch to pressure a clinic. The words were polite enough to be irrefutable and sharp enough to leave no room for a comeback. Victor hadn't raised his voice. Hadn't made a threat. He'd simply placed her in a position, someone overreaching, with the calm of a man accustomed to sitting at the head of every negotiation. Mrs. Whitmore held his gaze for a few seconds, then stood. I'll reconsider, she said, the edge in her voice noticeably blunted. She turned and walked out, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor. When the oak door closed, Victor didn't turn to look at Skye. He simply nodded at Hannah, the receptionist still standing behind the counter with reddened eyes, then walked straight out the side entrance, where Reed was waiting in the car. He didn't wait for a thank you. Didn't take advantage of the moment. Didn't linger. Skye stood watching the door close behind Victor, then kept staring for a few more seconds even though there was nothing left to see. Hannah stepped toward her, voice shaking, Skye, I'm sorry. The data entry error was mine. Hannah, a system error isn't yours alone. We'll update the cross-check procedures for the whole team. Skye placed a hand on the girl's shoulder. Are you okay? Hannah nodded, eyes still red but steadier. Skye returned to her office, closed the door, sat down, and exhaled. She wasn't thinking about Mrs. Whitmore. Difficult clients came with the territory, and she'd handled it right, acknowledged the fault without caving to unreasonable demands, defended her staff without being confrontational. She was thinking about Victor. The way he'd stepped in. No one had asked him to. No one had needed him to. He'd just stood there, said a few sentences, and Mrs. Whitmore, a woman used to commanding an army of service staff, had backed down. And then he'd backed down too. Hadn't waited for a thank you. Hadn't leveraged the moment to close the distance between them. He'd helped, nodded at Hannah, and disappeared. Julian would never have done that. Not because Julian was a coward. Julian would have intervened, but afterward, he'd have stayed. He'd have said, see. You need me. He'd have turned her vulnerable moment into proof of his own necessity. Julian helped the way people make investments, always expecting a return. Victor helped like someone paying a debt, then walked away. Skye sat in her office until the hallway lights went dim. She drove to her grandparents' house, ate dinner in silence, and went to her room earlier than usual. Lying in bed, she stared at the ceiling. She thought about the things that knowledge and money couldn't shield you from. She was talented. She had a loving family. She had her skills. She had her own clinic. But today, with Mrs. Whitmore sitting there with that cold stare and those silken threats, Skye had realized something. She was building this clinic alone, in a city she didn't fully belong to yet. Her grandparents gave her emotional grounding, but they couldn't stand beside her at the reception desk when the next Mrs. Whitmore walked in. In Shanghai, she'd had Julian. Whatever kind of person he turned out to be, Julian's presence, son of Thomas Thorne, renowned surgeon, had been a layer of armor she hadn't recognized until she lost it. In Atlanta, she had no armor at all. Until this afternoon. The image of Victor standing slightly forward, hands in pockets, voice calm but every word carrying weight, that image made her feel something she'd been denying herself for over a year. Protected. Not the suffocating kind. Not the, you need me, kind. The kind where someone quietly steps in front of you, handles it, and then walks away, leaving the decision of whether to call them back entirely in your hands. Her phone buzzed. Skye looked at the screen. Her heart gave a sharp, involuntary beat when she saw the name. Victor Sterling. Atlanta might be a little different from Shanghai. If you ever need someone in your corner out here, I can help. Until you settle in. You've made my body better, so I'd like you to feel safe about this city too, like a second home. Because if you leave again, I'll have to go find you, and that sounds exhausting. Sky read it 3 times. The last line, half joke, half something else, made her laugh softly in the dark. Then the laugh faded, and she lay there, eyes on the ceiling, phone pressed to her chest. He hadn't said, "You need me." He'd said, "I can help, until you settle in." He hadn't said, "Don't go." He'd said, "If you go, I'll have to find you," in the voice of someone smiling. Sky lay there for a long time. She didn't reply that night. But the next morning, as Atlanta's sun hit the tops of the old oaks outside her window, she picked up her phone and typed. "I'm not going anywhere. But thanks for the offer. See you at the next session, I'll handle your case myself this time." Not a love confession. But they both understood, she'd just reopened the door she'd closed herself. And this time, she'd chosen to open it with her own hands. The first treatment session after Sky took Victor's case back was quieter than she'd expected. No awkward moments. No questions about why she'd vanished for 2 weeks. Victor lay down on the treatment bed, closed his eyes, and let her work, as if the 2-week gap had been nothing more than a long breath between 2 notes. But when Sky placed the final needle into the Higa point on his right hand, the hand with the reconstruction scar from 20 years ago, she noticed something different. Victor's muscle fibers responded more smoothly. His core temperature was more stable. 2 weeks with Dr. Nguyen hadn't been wasted, but clearly his body responded to her hands in a way it didn't respond to anyone else's. She withdrew the needles, wiped her hands, and spoke only after Victor sat up and straightened his shirt. "Victor." He turned. "What happened the other day, with Mrs. Whitmore?" She swallowed, hating the feeling of owing someone but knowing she couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. "Thank you. You didn't have to do that." Victor looked at her for a moment, then gave a slight shake of his head. "You're thanking me for that? I just told a client the truth. Not worth carrying around." "It was worth it to me." A beat of silence. Victor slid his hands into his pockets, tilting his head. "Then don't thank me with medicine. I've had enough of your herbal concoctions, the bitterness haunts my dreams." The corner of his mouth lifted. "Buy me dinner. In return, I'll take you somewhere that'll show you why Atlanta is worth staying for." Sky almost said no. The protective instinct that had built walls for the past 2 weeks flickered like a warning light. But his tone was so casual that the invitation sounded like a suggestion between acquaintances, not a come on. "Fine," she said. "Saturday. 7 o'clock. You picked the restaurant, I picked the time." The restaurant Victor took her to wasn't a rooftop lounge or a candlelit fine dining spot. It was a small place tucked into a quiet alley in Inman Park, old red brick facade, low wooden ceilings inside, warm string lights, and the smell of meat smoking over oak coals. "This place isn't on any Michelin list," Victor said, pulling out her chair. "But they've got a 12-hour smoked brisket, and if you finish a plate without ordering another, I will seriously question your taste." Sky laughed, the sound escaping before she could control it. She deliberated in front of the mirror longer than she cared to admit that evening. Not to impress, or at least that's what she told herself, but because she didn't want to look like a doctor fresh off a shift. She'd settled on a deep forest green silk dress with a boat neckline, fitted but not tight. Her curls fell loose over her shoulders instead of their usual updo. A pair of small gold earrings, last year's birthday gift from Grandma Amara, were the only jewelry she wore. Victor was different too. No black suit. No crime boss aura. He wore a charcoal linen shirt rolled to the elbows, collar open, looking like any Atlanta man out for a Saturday dinner. Only his eyes were the same. Still sharp, still alert, but tonight they were softer, as if he deliberately lowered a layer of armor so she could see what was behind it. Dinner started with brisket, butter mashed potatoes, and tangy coleslaw. Sky had to admit, she ordered a second plate. "You owe me an apology for doubting your palate," Victor said, eyes glinting. "I apologize for underestimating a Mafia boss's restaurant picking skills," she replied, and they both laughed. The conversation drifted into subjects neither of them had expected. Victor asked about Jiangnan. She told him about the damp winters in Shanghai, the tofu vendor's call at 5 in the morning, the strange feeling of growing up between two cultures without fully belonging to either. Victor listened in a way Sky rarely encountered in men, no interruptions, no rush to offer opinions, just a nod in the right places and a question at the points she assumed nobody cared about. Then he told her about Atlanta. Not Sterling's Atlanta. The Atlanta of Sunday mornings when his mother would take him to the flea market at Ponce City Market to buy homemade peach preserves and hot cornbread. About autumn in Piedmont Park, when the leaves turned gold and the whole city smelled of cinnamon. About a small coffee shop in Little Five Points where he used to sit alone, before life turned him into a man who could no longer sit alone in public. Sky realized he was showing her a different Atlanta, not the city of power and violence, but the city of quiet mornings and homemade peach jam. He was giving her a reason to stay. When dinner ended, it was fully dark. They walked a short stretch along the old brick sidewalk under massive oaks and yellow street lamps. Neither touched the other. But the distance between their shoulders was far narrower than the distance between a doctor and a patient. Victor stopped by the car. "You finished 2 plates of brisket," he said, his face mock serious. "That's a good sign. A true Atlantan never stops at the first. So I've passed the test. Getting there. You still need to try the summer peach cobbler and Miss Mabel's sweet tea over in Grant Park before you qualify." Sky laughed and shook her head. She opened the car door and got in. Before pulling it shut, she looked at him. "Thank you for tonight, Victor. I understand now why you love this city. Thank you for giving Atlanta another chance." She closed the door. Victor stepped back. The SUV pulled away. Sky watched through the rearview mirror. He was still standing there, hands in pockets, under the yellow glow of a street lamp, until her car turned the corner and he vanished from sight. After that night, the distance between them shifted in a way that needed no announcement. The late-night texts returned, but the tone was different. Lighter. More natural. Less tentative. Victor sent her a photo of a new packet of ginger tea with the caption, "Aged or young?" And Sky laughed alone in her room at 11 p.m. and typed back, "Aged. You're making progress." The next treatment session went as usual, needles, herbs, professional silence. But afterward, as Victor stood to adjust his shirt and Sky tidied the instrument tray, he paused at the door. "Sky." She turned. His voice was lower, slower than usual. "Actually, I'm the one who should be thanking you. For the treatment. That's my job, Victor." "No. Not for the treatment." He turned fully to face her. His eyes, the eyes Sky had grown used to reading through a clinical lens across all those sessions, held something she hadn't seen there before. Not pain. Not vigilance. Something closer to the purest form of gratitude. "For the past 10 years, my body was the only thing I had to protect the people around me. And for the past 10 years, it was also the thing killing me. Every doctor I saw looked at me like an unsolvable equation, then shook their head and walked away." He paused. "You were the first person who didn't shake her head. The first person who said, 'I'll teach you to regulate it,' instead of, 'I'll try to put it out.' The changes I can feel in my body now, money can't buy that, Sky." She stood still, the instrument tray still in her hands. He smiled faintly, then walked out. "Thank you, Sky." The door closed. Sky stood alone in the treatment room, looked down at the tray in her hands, and realized her fingers were trembling. Not from fear. But because for the first time in a very long while, someone had looked straight at her and said, "You changed my life," and she believed the person saying it. That night, lying in bed, she found herself not thinking about Julian. Not about Shanghai. Not about the question of whether she was reading someone wrong. She thought only about those shining eyes. That deep voice. The feeling that something was beginning between them, fragile, still nameless, but warm. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid of it. The thing that was beginning hadn't had time to grow before it was spotted by eyes that should never have seen it. It was a Tuesday morning. Sky had barely opened the clinic doors when Reed was already standing at the reception desk, his face harder than usual. "Dr. Vance, I need to speak with you privately." Skye led him into her office. Reed placed an iPad on the desk and opened 3 photos from the security cameras, a strange car parked across from the clinic for 4 consecutive days, always during the hours she arrived and left. "We verified the plates," Reed said, voice dry as sand. "The car belongs to a shell company owned by the Moretti family. They're Sterling's biggest rival in the South. They've been watching the clinic, specifically, watching you." Skye looked at the photos. Her stomach clenched. "Watching me? Why?" "Because you're the closest person to Victor Sterling right now, outside his family. Moretti isn't stupid. They know how to find a pressure point." Reed looked at her squarely. "Mr. Sterling wants me to bring you to the family's beach estate. Temporarily, until the situation is handled. The clinic will have its own security detail. Your grandparents will be looked after as well." Skye sat in silence for a while. She wasn't scared. Or more precisely, she was scared, but not the paralyzing kind. The sharp, lucid kind. The kind that comes when someone is weighing options very quickly. She could refuse. Call the police. Handle it herself. She'd been handling everything alone for over a year, from opening the clinic to facing down Mrs. Whitmore. She didn't need anyone to protect her. But then she looked at the photos again. The car, parked at the exact angle to see the clinic door. 4 days straight. And she thought of her grandparents, 2 elderly people in the suburbs who knew nothing about the world she'd accidentally stepped into. "My grandparents," she said. "Are they safe?" "Someone's been posted there since yesterday, Dr. Vance. Mr. Sterling arranged it before telling you." Skye raised her head. He'd arranged protection for her grandparents before letting her know. Not to show off. Because he'd known it would be the first thing she asked. She closed her eyes for a second. Then opened them. "All right. Give me half an hour to rearrange the clinic schedule and call my grandparents." Reed nodded, stood, then paused at the door. "Dr. Vance. I've been with Victor Sterling since he was 16. I've never seen him worry about anyone outside his own family." His rigid face softened just slightly. "Until he met you." Reed stepped out. Skye sat alone in her office, gazing out at the small courtyard behind the clinic, where she'd planted lemongrass and ginger in terracotta pots she'd carried home from the market. A little over a year ago, she'd opened this clinic believing Atlanta would be where she started over. A quiet life. A career she'd built on her own. No dependence on anyone. Now she was about to walk into a mafia boss's estate because someone had been watching her. Skye picked up her phone and called Grandma Amara. "Grandma, the clinic has a special intensive training program. I'll need to stay on site for about a week. Don't worry about me." Amara was quiet for a moment, longer than usual. "Be careful, sweetheart," she said softly, asking nothing more. Maybe she knew more than Skye gave her credit for. Or maybe she simply trusted her. Skye hung up, stood, and began packing. Outside the window, Atlanta was still sunny. But she knew that from today on, this city would no longer be just ginger and golden light. On the 3rd night, the Moretti threat temporarily receded behind a backroom deal whose details Skye didn't ask about. She knew that was enough. She'd just gotten out of the shower, damp curls spilling over her shoulders, a pearl-colored silk nightgown clinging faintly to her skin. The room was filled with the scent of sea salt drifting through the window and the soft glow of a bedside lamp. She was combing her hair in front of the mirror when she realized the reflection in the glass held more than one person. Victor stood leaning against the doorframe, tie gone, 2 collar buttons undone, his face still carrying the weariness of a full day of negotiations. But his eyes weren't tired. His eyes were looking at her, and Skye knew this wasn't the way a patient looked at his doctor. The comb in her hand froze in midair. "You came in without knocking," she said, her voice steadier than the heartbeat hammering inside her chest. Victor didn't answer right away. He pushed off the doorframe and walked toward her, slowly, step by step, like a man giving himself time to turn back but knowing full well he wouldn't. He stopped just behind her. The heat from his body reached the back of her neck before his hands did. In the mirror, Skye saw his eyes, darker than usual, deeper than usual, and she knew that in this moment, one of them should step back. Neither did. His fingers touched the strap on her shoulder. Just touched, so lightly that if she breathed any harder, it would slip. But he didn't pull. He waited. "I want to make things right," he said, his voice dropping into something she felt more through her spine than her ears. "For what happened at the clinic. For dragging you into this world." Sky looked at him through the mirror. Her hand lowered the comb to the vanity. "You didn't drag me," she said, and turned to face him. The distance between them shrank to centimeters. Close enough for her to catch the scent of cedarwood on his shirt tangled with sea salt. Close enough to see the pulse at the hollow of his throat beating faster than it should, and to realize that this man, the one who'd once bent steel with his bare hands, was trembling. Sky raised her hand and placed her palm flat against his chest, right over the heart that was pounding like a war drum. Not a doctor's touch. Not checking a pulse. Just a woman needing to feel that this moment was real. Victor closed his eyes when her hand made contact. His jaw clenched. His entire body, the colossal machine she'd spent hours healing, went taut under her palm like a string pulled to its absolute limit. Then he opened his eyes. Looked down at her. And waited. Sky knew what he was waiting for. He was waiting for her permission. She rose on her toes, threaded her fingers into the hair at the nape of his neck, and pulled him down. Her lips brushed the corner of his mouth, light, barely there, like a butterfly landing and lifting off. But it was enough. Victor lifted her up. Not roughly. Not in haste. The way he held her was the way he held his mother's pocket watch, the most precious thing he owned, the thing he was terrified of breaking if he held it too tight. Silver moonlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, spilling across the bed, the silk, the skin. The sound of waves striking the cliffs below kept time for the room, steady, patient, as though even the sea were holding its breath. Hands that had once crushed steel now moved across her body with a care Sky had never encountered anywhere, slow, reverent, reading every small response as if she were a piece of music he was learning by heart, note by note. And Sky, the woman who'd stood on her own for so long, who'd built walls, kept distance, refused to let anyone close, finally closed her eyes. She let go of everything. Let go of Julian's name. Let go of the fear of reading someone wrong. Let go of the doctor. Let go of the strong, accomplished woman. Under those hands, she was only Sky. And being allowed to just be Sky, nothing more, nothing less, was the thing she'd craved most without knowing it. When Sky opened her eyes, the room was still bathed in moonlight. Victor lay beside her, one heavy arm draped across her waist, warm, solid, impossibly still. His breathing was even. For the first time, she saw his face truly at rest, no vigilance, no calculation, no pain. She lay there, listening to the waves and his breathing, and realized something so simple she'd nearly missed it. The fire inside his body, the thing that had nearly consumed him, wasn't burning to destroy tonight. It was burning to keep them warm. And Sky, for the first time in a very long while, didn't feel cold. The deal had been signed. Victor surrendered 15% of the southern port transport market, a major concession, enough to give Moretti reason to stand down. Reed had flown to New York to meet Balthazar Moretti in person. Hands were shaken. Contracts were notarized. On paper, the war was over. Sky returned to the clinic after a week at the beach estate, flanked by 2 bodyguards and a packed patient schedule waiting for her. She thought everything was settled. Victor didn't. She only learned this afterward, sitting in the wreckage, trying to piece together the sequence of events. Reed told her that on the very night the deal was signed, Victor had said one thing to him. Moretti accepted the concession too easily. Greedy men don't stop after one bite. He didn't trust the agreement to hold. So during the week Sky was at the estate, Victor and Reed had quietly prepared a plan B for the clinic, not because he wanted war, but because he understood the way men like Moretti thought. Giving up 15% didn't satisfy their greed. It only made them believe Sterling was weak. And when Moretti smelled weakness, they'd strike, not at the docks or the heavily guarded estate, but at the softest target, the clinic. Plan B didn't turn Amber Heat into a steel fortress. It turned the clinic into something an attacker wouldn't anticipate, a maze. The reinforced glass partitions were strengthened but still looked normal. The motion sensor lighting was recalibrated to deliver blinding full-room flashes in half a second. The treatment rooms in the back were arranged into concealed firing positions, room for 2 to hide and 1 to shoot. Skye knew none of this when she walked into the clinic that morning. All she knew was the familiar scent of lemongrass and ginger, Hannah's greeting from the front desk, and a list of 7 patients waiting. 15 minutes into her shift, tires screamed in the parking lot. Skye looked up from her screen. Through the glass, she saw 3 black pickups slamming to a stop at the entrance. Doors flew open. Figures in long coats poured out, fast and silent, the silence of men who'd rehearsed this. She hadn't even stood up when the first shot fired. The front glass shattered. Hannah screamed. One of Skye's bodyguards shoved her to the floor, the other drew his weapon. In the chaos of those first seconds, Skye heard only gunfire, steel, and someone barking orders in Italian. Moretti. The deal was in the trash. Skye crawled behind the reception desk, the oak counter she'd been so proud of choosing when she opened the clinic, which she now realized Victor had reinforced with steel plating during the past week. She pressed her back against the wood, her heartbeat so loud she could hear it in her ears. Hannah lay beside her, face white, both hands clamped over her ears. Moretti's men flooded the lobby. Then Reed's voice, cold as steel over the comms, said a single word. Now. The clinic's ceiling lights flashed blinding white. Not ordinary light. A high-intensity strobe that hit the eyes dead-on, enough to cause temporary blindness for 3 to 5 seconds. Immediately after, the overhead nozzles, originally the clinic's disinfectant spray system, now loaded with high-concentration sedative gas, fired simultaneously. White mist rained down over the main lobby like an artificial storm. Moretti's men collapsed mid-stride, some shooting, some running, some shielding their eyes. In the brief window of chaos, Victor's guards surged from the back treatment rooms and ended it with short, precise bursts of gunfire. 15 seconds. From Reed's command to the last shot, 15 seconds. Skye lay behind the reception desk, arms wrapped around Hannah's head, chest locked tight, counting every single one. When the sedative mist cleared, Skye slowly raised her head. Her clinic, the place where she'd planted lemongrass in terracotta pots, brewed tea for patients, placed her very first needle into Victor Sterling's body, was filled with the smell of gunpowder and broken glass. Blood soaked the carpet. Bodies lay still, some Moretti's men, some Victor's. None of hers were dead. But several were wounded. Skye looked around, one hand still gripping Hannah's shoulder, and understood something that would take her a very long time to digest. Victor had prepared for this scenario. Not because he'd wanted a fight. But because he'd known the deal might be betrayed, and if it was, the first place they'd target would be her. He'd been right. As the smoke cleared, Victor came to her, breathing heavy, his expensive suit smeared with dust and blood. He helped Skye to her feet, his eyes scanning her body with frantic concern. "You're safe now, Skye," he said hoarsely, then signaled Reed to bring the car and get her away from the scene immediately. The moment they stepped outside and headed for the waiting Bentley, its engine already running, a roar of acceleration ripped through the air. From the alley across the street, a battered car came flying straight at her at suicidal speed. One of Moretti's surviving men had decided on a final, desperate act. Everything happened in less than 2 seconds. Victor didn't think. He threw himself in front of her. The impact was sickening. His body was hurled through the air and slammed hard into the pavement. The sound of flesh and bone hitting asphalt was horrifying. "Victor!" Skye screamed, running to him. He lay there, motionless, blood starting to spread beneath him, yet his eyes were still struggling to find hers, making sure she hadn't suffered a single scratch. The Sterling family's private hospital sat isolated in a whispering pine forest, so quiet it felt extreme. No frantic ambulance sirens, just the steady beep of advanced machines and the sharp smell of antiseptic mingled with the scent of leather from the waiting room chairs. Victor lay amid a web of wires and 4 lines. The lower half of his body had been crushed in the direct impact. A surviving Moretti operative had driven a car into him just outside the clinic, while he stood shielding her. His head was wrapped in white bandages. He'd been in a deep coma for 48 hours. Skye sat beside him, her eyes painfully dry from 2 sleepless nights. She wasn't only hurting as the woman who loved him. She was hurting as a doctor, because she understood what was happening inside his body, and she understood better than anyone in this hospital that conventional medicine wouldn't save him. She'd gone through every record with the medical team. The scans showed that Victor's muscle fibers weren't just physically damaged, they were devouring themselves from within, as if the energy accumulated over all those years had turned on its own host. Skye knew why. She'd suspected it since the very first treatment session, the abnormal heat signature, the pattern of cellular expansion, the way his fibers operated under constant chemical stimulation. She'd reopened the Titan G research files from her Shanghai days. She'd been building a hypothesis in her head for weeks. But a hypothesis was still just a hypothesis. She didn't have confirmed proof. And now, Victor was lying here, comatose, and she needed that proof, immediately. The door opened softly. Kane Sterling and Elara walked in. The face of the most powerful man in Atlanta was carved deep with exhaustion, but his back was still straight, still carrying the authority of an old lion, even one who'd been wounded too many times. Elara followed her father, eyes swollen, her dark velvet dress wrinkled as though she'd been wearing it since yesterday and hadn't changed. This was the first time Skye had met Victor's family outside the stories he'd told her during late-night texts. Kane, the father who drowned in alcohol after losing his wife, then pulled himself back up. Elara, the younger sister who held the entire Sterling financial and logistical empire together with a mind colder than steel. Victor had spoken about them with a mix of reverence and protectiveness, as if they were the only reason he still fought. Now she understood why. "Skye, you've been here too long," Kane said, placing a hand on her shoulder, his voice deep and hoarse. He called her by her first name, natural, without formality, as though Victor had told him enough to consider her family. "Get some rest. If Victor wakes up and sees you like this, he'll blame himself." "Go on, Skye," Elara added, managing half a smile. "Dad and I can keep watch. You've done everything you can." Skye stood, her head spinning. She squeezed Victor's hand one more time, cold, heavy, still, then walked out. But she didn't go to rest. She went to find answers. Reed was standing in the hallway, leaning against the wall opposite Victor's room. Gaunt, dark circles under his eyes, but still there, a loyal shadow that refused to leave. "MS. Vance, you need some caffeine." His voice was bone dry. "Let me take you to the beverage area." Skye let him lead, not because she needed coffee, but because she needed Reed. In a quiet corner of the lobby, Reed pushed a hot cup toward her. Rain had started lashing the windows outside. "Reed," Skye said, both hands around the cup but not drinking. "I need you to tell me exactly what happened when Victor was 16. Not the summary. Every detail you remember. The surgeon's name, the drug, the dosage, the post-op protocol, anything." Reed looked at her, silent for a moment. Then he understood, this wasn't curiosity. This was a doctor looking for a way to save her patient. "I'm the son of the man who cooked for the Sterlings for nearly 30 years, Reed began, his voice slow and heavy. "I grew up alongside Victor. That year, a devastating car accident. Muscles completely crushed, prognosis was death or permanent disability. Kane and Leah tried everything. In the end, they signed the consent for a doctor to use Titan G." Skye kept her face calm, but her heart was beating faster. There it was. Confirmation. No longer a hypothesis. "The surgeon's name," she said. "The exact name. Thomas Thorne." Reed nodded. "Brilliant man, but he only stayed in Atlanta about 2 years before moving on. We lost contact long ago." Thomas Thorne. Julian's father. Skye had known, had suspected for a long time, but hearing Reed say the name, every remaining piece fell into place with a click she could almost hear. During 5 years in Shanghai, Julian had talked about the boldest surgery of my father's career as an interesting case to debate over dinner. He defended Thomas's decision, there was no better option than Titan G. And Skye had argued back, if you inject Titan G, you need a periodic detoxification protocol, or the body will accumulate heat until it destroys itself. Julian had laughed and said she was building treatment plans for patients who didn't exist. That patient was lying 30 meters away, in a coma, on the verge of dying from the exact thing she'd warned about. "Reed, I need to go home and get something." 15 minutes. Sky ran to the parking lot. She drove to her grandparents' house, tore through the drawers in her old room, and found a medical notebook from her Shanghai years, a dark blue hardcover, spine-worn, pages dense with handwritten notes in black ink and pencil. She flipped to the Titan G chapter. Yellowed pages where she'd once sketched metabolic pathways by hand. In the margins, Julian's annotations, slanting and elegant, every line a rebuttal of her theory. Sky didn't look at those annotations. She looked at her own diagrams. Thomas Thorne had been right to choose Titan G, it was the only way to save Victor's life. But his post-operative protocol hadn't accounted for the possibility that Victor's body would permanently integrate the compound instead of flushing it out. That scenario was so rare it was nearly impossible, and in the context of an emergency procedure on a 16-year-old, no one could fault Thomas for not anticipating it. But Sky had anticipated it. In the theoretical model Julian had mocked, she'd mapped out exactly this scenario, Titan G fusing permanently with muscle tissue, transforming fibers into cable-like structures with strength beyond human limits, but without a heat-release mechanism, the body would cook itself from the inside out. And she'd written the treatment protocol for it. A detoxification and muscle restructuring regimen combining Eastern and Western medicine, acupuncture to open natural heat-release channels, herbal formulas to control inflammatory response, running parallel with modern medical therapy to stabilize cellular function. Sky clutched the notebook to her chest and raced back to the hospital. Sky convened the doctors directly treating Victor into the conference room. She laid the notebook open on the table, presented the Titan G metabolic diagrams, explained the heat accumulation mechanism, and laid out her intervention protocol. The doctors exchanged glances. The department chief shook his head. Dr. Vance, this protocol has never been clinically tested. Combining acupuncture with cellular intervention during a deep coma, the risk is enormous. I know, Sky said, her voice calm but unyielding. But if we don't intervene, his muscle fibers will undergo complete necrosis within 72 hours. Even if he wakes up after that, there will be nothing left to save. You're certain about the compound's origin? Dr. Thomas Thorne administered Titan G to Victor 20 years ago. I know this because Thomas Thorne is the father of the man I lived with for 5 years in Shanghai. I studied this compound's metabolic pathway before I even knew the patient existed. And I've suspected Victor was carrying Titan G since his very first treatment session, the heat signature, the fiber expansion pattern, the acupuncture response, all consistent with my theoretical model. The conference room went silent. Sky looked at each of them in turn. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to read my data, compare it with the current scan results, and judge for yourselves. If the data doesn't convince you, I'll step back. The department chief studied her for a few more seconds, then pulled the notebook toward him. 20 minutes later, he looked up. The model fits, he said, his tone still cautious but distinctly different. I'll agree to try. But I need you at my side throughout the entire procedure. Sky nodded. Then she and the chief walked into Victor's room. Kane and Alara were still there. Sky drew a deep breath. She looked at Kane, a man who, 20 years ago, had signed the consent form for Thorne to use Titan G to save his son, and was now being asked to trust a different woman with a different protocol to save his son again. Sir. Alara. Her voice was steady, though the faintest tremor slipped through at the end. Dr. Thomas Thorne, the man who saved Victor's life all those years ago, was the father of my ex-partner. I understand the mechanism of the compound Victor is carrying. I've been researching it long before I knew Victor existed. She paused. I'm asking permission to intervene. This is the only chance to bring him back without losing his musculature. Kane looked at her for a long time. His eyes, the eyes of a man who'd lost his wife, nearly lost his son, and was now staring down the possibility of losing his son again, searched her face as if looking for something. Then he found it. I trust you, Sky, he said. Bring him back to us. Alara said nothing. She just took Sky's hand, squeezed it, brief, tight, trembling, then let go. When everyone stepped out to prepare for the procedure, the hospital room held only Sky and Victor. She sat beside the bed and took his hand. Large, rough, cold, a hand that had once bent steel, that had once touched the silk strap on her shoulder with a tremor she would never forget. She pressed it against her cheek. Victor. Her voice was a whisper, and the tears she'd held back for 48 hours finally fell. "Can you hear me?" She looked at his face, terrifyingly peaceful, stripped of every line of vigilance or calculation. "Julian's father saved your life 20 years ago. He gave you the chance to live. But he also left you carrying a burden too heavy for one person, one you've shouldered for 10 years with no one knowing how to take it off." She breathed in, breathed out. "Now it's my turn." She leaned down and kissed his rough knuckles. Beneath the skin, she felt a pulse, weak, but steady. "I won't let this fire burn you down anymore. But you have to fight too, you idiot." She laughed through her tears. "Don't you dare give up now. You still owe me a peach cobbler and Miss Mabel's sweet tea at Grant Park." Silence. The steady beep of the monitors. Rain against the windows. The sound of her breathing. Then his finger moved. Just barely. A tiny twitch, almost imperceptible. But Sky, the woman whose hands could read things scanners couldn't see, felt it as clearly as hearing her own name. He was still fighting. Sky squeezed his hand, stood, wiped her tears, and walked out of the room. She had a procedure to perform. Victor drifted through a vast white emptiness. No gunfire. No smell of blood. No searing heat in his veins, the thing that had been both his weapon and his sentence for 10 years. Only stillness. Pure and boundless, so total he couldn't tell if he was standing or floating. Then, in the center of that light, a figure appeared. His mother. Leah stood there, small, gentle, exactly as his memory had preserved her for 10 years. She didn't speak. She only looked at him with shining eyes, and Victor realized what that shine was. Not tears. Pride. She stepped closer and opened her arms. The embrace was warm and weightless, not the embrace of the living, but more like morning sunlight slipping through a curtain, touching skin without mass. Yet it warmed every cold corner inside him, the places that 10 years of war, 10 years of pain, 10 years of holding everything together had carved even deeper. Leah smiled. Then let go. Drifted back into the white mist. Victor wanted to call out to her. Wanted to hold on. But a pull from behind, fierce, warm, and real, lifted him out of the light. He didn't know it was the pull of life. But he knew it was the direction his mother wanted him to go. Victor opened his eyes. The first thing he felt wasn't pain. It was silence. A deep, strange silence. The violent roar that had been a constant in his bloodstream, the sound he'd grown so used to he'd forgotten it existed, was gone. In its place, something calm, something light, flowing through him with quiet ease, like a river after a flood finally finding its old bed again. He shifted slightly. Realized his hand was being gripped tightly. Sky had fallen asleep beside his hospital bed, her curls spilled across the white sheets. Her face was gaunt, dark circles under her eyes, skin paler than normal, fingers still clutching his hand even in sleep. She looked like someone who'd been fighting for days without stopping to eat or rest. Victor tried to say her name, but his throat was parched. Only a faint sound escaped. That was enough. Sky jolted awake. Her amber eyes flew open, blurred from exhaustion, then blazing bright the moment they met his. She couldn't speak right away. Her lips moved, her hand tightened, and the tears, the ones Victor guessed she'd been holding back for a long time, poured out. "Victor. You're awake. You're really awake." She leaned toward him but stopped short, doctor's instinct holding her back, afraid of disturbing his wounds. Her small hands fumbled across his face, touching his forehead, his cheek, his jawline, as if she needed to confirm by touch that this wasn't a dream. "Don't say anything. You need more rest." She laughed and cried at the same time, tears falling onto his cheek. Victor smiled. A real smile, the kind he couldn't remember having last. Not the thin, brief one at the family dinner table meant to reassure Kane and Ilara. Not the polite one from negotiations. This one started somewhere deep in his chest, in the place where Titan GS fire had once reigned and now only stillness remained. He felt like a completely different person. As if the old Victor, the one who'd braced himself under borrowed strength for 10 years, had died in the collision outside the clinic. And the man lying here, watching Sky cry over him, was a new version. Lighter. Emptier. But for the first time, that emptiness wasn't frightening. Because it was being filled by something that didn't need Titan G to create. 2 months passed. Victor stood at the window of his study in the beach estate, looking out toward the bustling port of Atlanta in the distance. He could walk normally again. His health had returned to about 80%. His legs still trembled faintly if he stood too long, but the simple act of walking on ordinary human legs felt like something out of a miracle. The battle at Amber Heat had become the final nail in the Moretti family's coffin. Their brutality, attacking after a signed agreement, hitting a civilian clinic, ramming a car into a man, had turned every other faction in the city against them. While Victor was unconscious, Kane had stepped in to handle what remained. The old fox didn't just eliminate the Morettis, he used the outrage of the other families to consolidate Sterling's position beyond challenge. Atlanta's power map had been redrawn. Victor had reclaimed the 15% he'd conceded and now held full control of the entire southern port system and the valuable lithium mines. Sterling was no longer one of the strongest. Sterling was the only king. But this king no longer possessed any extraordinary power. After Sky's detoxification protocol, the Titan G compound had been neutralized completely. The superhuman muscular strength, the thing that had let him bend steel, decimate formations in 3 minutes, become the undefeated legend of the South, was gone. Permanently. Victor knew this from the first day of rehabilitation. He clenched his fist as hard as he could, and felt ordinary force. Stronger than average, thanks to his solid physical foundation, but that was all. No heat surge. No fibers expanding like cables. No sense of the air warping around his knuckles. Just a human hand. He stood alone in the estate's training room, clenching and releasing, and for the first time felt something close to loss. Not regret over losing a weapon. But the grief of losing the part of himself that had defined him for a decade. Who was Victor Sterling without Titan G? Every crime boss had guns, men, money. But only he could charge alone into an enemy formation and walk out untouched. Only he made rivals fear not the empire, but the man himself. That was gone now. He sat on the gym floor, leaned his back against the wall, and stared at the ceiling. Then he realized something else. In 10 years of carrying Titan G, he'd never slept a night without dreaming of fire. Never woken up without feeling his body being cooked from the inside. Never held anyone's hand without wondering how much longer that hand would still work. 10 years of living with the constant dread that each passing day brought his body one step closer to collapse. 10 years on a countdown. And now, for the first time, the clock had stopped. Victor sat on the gym floor, looking down at his 2 ordinary hands, and felt something he couldn't find a word for. Light. Not light because he was weaker. Light because the heaviest thing he'd carried for 10 years, the fear that his own body would betray him at the worst possible moment, was gone. He didn't need to be afraid each morning anymore. Didn't need Reed to keep a dry ice tank and syringes in the trunk anymore. Didn't need to look in the mirror and wonder if today was the last day. Victor placed his hand on his chest, where it used to burn, now holding only a normal heartbeat, steady, slow. The heartbeat of a human heart. He closed his eyes. And for the first time in 10 years, when he closed his eyes, he didn't see fire. He saw the scent of lemongrass and ginger. The warm glow of a clinic. Amber eyes looking at him without fear. A small hand placed on his chest, right over his heart, not to check his pulse, but to stay. Victor opened his eyes, stood up, and walked out of the gym. He didn't need Titan G to be strong. He needed to be healthy enough to walk with Sky along the Inman Park sidewalk on Saturday nights. Healthy enough to stand beside her when the next misses. Whitmore walked into the clinic. Healthy enough to live, not survive, but truly live, alongside the woman who'd saved him by taking away the most powerful thing he had. He stood by the window, looking up at Atlanta's deep blue sky. Somewhere in that white space between life and death, his mother had smiled. Maybe she'd seen this moment long before he did, the moment her son finally understood that true strength doesn't live in iron fists. It lives in a heart that knows how to love, and how to be loved in return. The legacy Leah had left him, and that Sky now carried forward, wasn't survival. It was knowing how to live a life that truly meant something. And Victor knew that on the other side of the city, where Amber Heat was slowly recovering from its scars, a woman was waiting for him, to write the next chapter together. Amber Heat had recovered about 70%. New glass. New carpet. The smell of gunpowder had given way once more to lemongrass and ginger. The bullet holes in the walls had been plastered over, but if you looked closely beneath the paint, you could still see the faint ridges, like scars on skin, healed but never fully gone. Skye stood outside the front door, squinting in the afternoon sun, and thought the clinic looked more like her than she'd realized. Inside, Hannah was laughing with a patient. The girl no longer flinched when a client raised their voice. Dr. Nguyen was checking the afternoon appointments. The scent of ginger tea drifted from treatment room 3, the room Skye still kept reserved for one particular patient, even though he was much healthier now. Familiar footsteps sounded on the sidewalk behind her. Victor stopped beside her and draped his jacket over her shoulders to block the wind. A natural gesture, no thought behind it, the kind of thing someone does after 1,000 times and will do 1,000 more. We should take a trip to China soon. His voice was as casual as someone discussing dinner plans. I imagine your parents in Shanghai are dying to meet the man who's put their daughter through all this. Skye looked at him. He stood there, linen shirt, hands in pockets, no longer weighed down by the invisible gravity of Titan G. His legs still trembled faintly if he stood too long, but he hid it well. Or maybe he wasn't hiding it, just no longer ashamed of it. She thought of Julian. Not because it still hurt. But the way you look back at an old road from the top of a hill, distant, clear, and with no desire to go back. Julian had called her naive. Had laughed at her thesis. Had chosen Shanghai over her because she didn't fit the golden frame he'd built for himself. Victor had never built a frame. He'd smashed the old one and asked her what she wanted to build instead. Skye tightened her hand around his. Let's go, she said. But you'll need to practice eating spicy food first. My father doesn't go easy in the kitchen. Victor laughed, a low, warm sound that drifted across the Atlanta sidewalk in the afternoon light. They walked on. Behind them, the oak door of Amber Heat closed in the sunshine. But she didn't look back.